Welcome to another session of ET Markets Crypto Meet. Today we have a very special guest, Mr. Malik Khan Kotadia, and Malik has brought together, and he's the founder of GIFT, an international body of representing fintech professionals who are leading professionals in their space, from more than 60 odd countries. Something that I am proud to be part of. And a brief about myself: I'm co-founder of two investment markets, Grex and RealX, and also co-lead the South Asia chapter of GIFT. Now, before I proceed, I thank Economic Times for producing this event and GIFT for being a knowledge partner. First, I would like you to take the stage and talk a freewheeling, roundup about what you see is happening around in fintech. I think you virtually travel the world, and I think what our viewers would like to see is what's happening everywhere. So please give us a dope.
Sure. Hi everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on whichever part of the world you are logging in from or watching this webcast. So it's my pleasure to be here. So Manish, you've given me a rather Herculean task of giving a snapshot of global and regional developments in just about 20 minutes, although we'll continue on the chat. So I'll do my best. And without further ado, let me then share my screen. Let me introduce our viewers to what I call as a new vocabulary of money. And that is what will continue to and will accelerate how the future of finance is evolving and changing. And this is brought to you by our Global Impact FinTech Forum, along with, of course, our strategic partners, ET Markets. And among the various hats I wear, I am also a professor of FinTech. So my students usually like to call me Prof, but we'll go on. So this is the FinTech vocabulary. I think some of us or many of us would have heard elements of this, but let's try and put things in context and let's try and make sense of this and why do I call it the new or the emerging vocabulary. So the first thing, of course, is the very term fintech has the tech part of it, right? So while there is tech has been the big enabler, driver, exponential tech, and that is essentially fueled by four forces, or what we call as the ABCD, and we look at that today. Basically, what are these four forces? AI, blockchain, cloud, and data, which are shaping and will only accelerate this reshaping of financial services. But I also believe that ABCD is incomplete without taking into account the E. And oftentimes we kind of either underestimate it or take it for granted, but the role of ecosystems is absolutely vital and key in the development. And in fact, to my mind, it is something that is now becoming a difference between a successful and not so successful fintech ecosystem. And one of the reasons why we are doing this talk and session here is, of course, to kind of foster and further the ecosystem with our partners, ET. So I should say the E here also stands for ET, which is doing a great job in helping foster the ecosystem in India. And we are glad to bring in our global perspectives as well. Then from the ABCDE, we go to the Fs, which are driving this, and we'll look at it in a little more detail. I decided not to go through every alphabet, but only the key ones. So I jumped straight into the PQR, which is around policies and regulations, the P and R, but also how important QR codes have become. They are probably not as ubiquitous or important in India, but when you go to markets in Southeast Asia or even parts of North Asia, the entire payments boom is largely fueled by QR codes. And then, finally, I always like to conclude by giving what I call as a quick reality check. So it's good to talk about, disruption and how the world will change in 10 years. These are all sexy topics to talk about, but let's also get a dose of reality. There are a lot of existing, continued, and ongoing, as well as new challenges which are going to come up along this journey. And I call them the STUV, which is basically STEM, digital talent, and the continued pain of the unbanked and the underbanked, and where perhaps the V or the virtual banks can play a role. So we'll try and look at this in just 20 minutes. So viewers and everyone, please bear with me if I'm going a little fast, but we'll try and deep dive into some of these, at least I promise, when Manish and I get onto our fireside chat. So let's look at the ABCDE. I think everybody now understands these or has heard of these at least. And the two key forces which are really disrupting financial services are the A and B, AI and blockchain. And of course, we don't have time to go into details. As I said, each of these is a 2-hour lecture of mine in itself. But the only thing I want to submit here is the impact of AI in financial services is across the board. And just last week, I had the pleasure of hosting a fireside chat with the senior director and the head of the Central Bank of Thailand. He is heading their big data and AI group. And it's fascinating how even the regulators are changing their working, their orientation and their engagement with the industry through the use of AI. So it's no longer about cute chatbots anymore. Let me clarify that. There's much more to it, and it's happening across the entire value chain. It's happening in the front office, of course, through voice banking and chatbots, etc. But it's equally happening in the back office with robotic process automation, etc. And middle office. So we all know about alternative credit scores, etc. But how much more sophisticated it has become. And I have seen this over the last, 7, 8, 9 years since it has come about, from the time when I was a banker at Citibank. When all talk of credits, alternative credit scoring was met with a lot of skepticism, to now where data has become much more ubiquitous and learning, the data models have become much more refined. So that's my key message here. We can't go into the details of each of these, but don't equate AI in banking with a very singular use case or a very narrow view of things. There's much more happening, and it's happening across the board, across the world. So it's no longer just a Silicon Valley or London or Singapore story. It's happening in, or perhaps happening more vibrantly in the developing world or the developing ecosystems as well. B, blockchain. I think today's session is also titled crypto, so there is no talk in fintech which is complete without a talk of blockchain. And I find it very interesting and at times also quite ironic and humorous, and I'll tell you why I say so. So I've been in this space for about 7 to 8 years, as Manish said, not just virtually, but before the pandemic I was literally traveling almost 250 days a year all over the world. I have spoken at almost every major blockchain conference, right from Las Vegas to Taiwan to and Dubai and Turkey and everything in the middle, Germany. So I've had my share of not just sharing the stage with real experts in the blockchain stage, but I have also seen some emerging and some very consistent trends. And it's really funny, of all of these technologies that I've put here, people talk rather dispassionately or very clinically about AI, right? They would talk about it as they would talk about a technology. They would talk about cloud as they would talk about a technology, even big data. But when it comes to blockchain, it almost feels like you're talking about a religion. People have such polarizing views on either ends. And I usually am not a very popular figure at times in crypto maximalist conference, not because I'm a skeptic, far from it. I have seen the space evolve and evolve very, very dramatically and exponentially over the last 8 or 9 years. I remember my first time talking about Bitcoin in 2011 when I was still a banker, and I was talking to my banking colleagues, and he said exactly what some people say in 2021 as well, that how will there be money without it being regulated by the central bank? And that was when Bitcoin was sub $10, and look at where it is now. So my point is not that it's changing the world, but my point also is that someone like me tries to take a very balanced, nuanced approach. It's not necessarily a centrist, middle of the road approach. I take a maximalist stance where I believe it's warranted. I take a very skeptical stance when there is a lot of nonsense and scams. And I was a big outspoken critic during the ICO wave of 2017, and we all know what happened after that. I have seen the same thing kind of being played out in some way or the other in the NFT space, etc. So disruptions are here to stay, and they will change the world in 10 years. But I always, even when I'm teaching my students or speaking at conferences, I always narrate Amara's law. We tend to underestimate the impact of technology in the long term, but we overestimate it in the short term. So everybody wants the world to change, and everybody, when you say you are in blockchain, the first question people ask is, so when is Bitcoin going to be, when will Bitcoin hit 100,000? And I say, I don't know, I don't care. That is not really my premise. I mean, Manish knows about it. Some of the great work which is happening in blockchain, in public goods, public services, whether it is in terms of delivery of public services, we've been involved in some way in assisting the Tamil Nadu blockchain, state blockchain as well. And I've involved with several other initiatives, whether it is in testing and trial of voting, etc. So there is a lot which is happening, which will continue to happen, but we can't take this either a very cultist, maximalist kind of approach that, hey, this is a religion and you can say no evil about it, or that, oh, hey, this is all rubbish and this is an out and out Ponzi scheme. The truth perhaps lies somewhere in the middle, but we have to take a balanced view. So we'll try and touch upon that. And again, we've seen so much, as I said, I've seen the Bitcoin come into play when nobody even looked at it. And then we saw this whole ICO mania in 2017, when anybody who had no clue for how to run a business was raising $25 million to initial coin offerings. So we saw the crypto winter of 2018. Then we saw when serious players like Coinbase and others really put their heads down and brought change into this industry. To CBDCs becoming a big trend along with stable coins, and the Facebook announcement of 2019 to NFTs. Cloud, again, we've seen this being a key driver. Early days yet, banks are, and the financial industry is still kind of learning to coexist with it, whether to and at least it's moved away from this urge for private clouds to hybrid clouds. And again, a welcome change I have seen is 4 or 5 years back or 6 years back, when I was a banker myself, if you went and talked to the regulator, even in progressive jurisdictions like Singapore or Hong Kong, they would say, sorry, no cloud, to the point where conversations are becoming much more open, structured and nuanced. It doesn't start with a no, but how can we? In fact, I have been involved and I have seen firsthand a very interesting project in the Philippines. And this is not one of those large banks. I'm talking about an actual rural bank in one of the provinces called Cantilan. Most people would not have even heard of it. I had not heard it despite staying in the Philippines for long. You can only reach there by boat. Cantilan Bank, a rural bank which is not even plugged into the national payment switch, became the first bank funded by and approved by the Central Bank of the Philippines as well as the Asian Development Bank to host their entire system entirely on the cloud. So the fact that a rural bank where you can't, in a location where you can't even reach without taking a boat onto a jetty, is now fully on the cloud is a big development. Long way to go. Large banks are still quite far away from that, but we are headed in that direction. Data, again, I think we all understand the ubiquitous role of data and big data, and we talk about the 3 V's of volume, variety, and velocity. But for me, what is important, and we are seeing this, we just saw yesterday the Facebook stock price crashed again, and the whistleblower came about. Cambridge Analytica scandal happened, some time back. We see these periodic episodes, but it's to me a sign of a larger shifting trend underneath the surface about data sovereignty. For far too long have the big techs used our data as if it was their monopoly, dropping in cookies in all ways, or these data management platforms mixing and mashing our data and showing us things in the most spooky of ways. At least we've come to a point now where both regulators as well as individuals are becoming cognizant of data rights. And we saw this happen in a big way with GDPR in Europe. And now I'll touch upon it briefly about how it's happening in other parts of the world, including China, etc. as well. And we are seeing this in the US also. And as I said, ecosystem is what kind of connects and binds these 4 together. Technology is, let me be honest, is no longer as much of a differentiator or a magic sauce as it was a few years ago. Even AI is now available through the cloud. So everybody can have access on a SaaS model to the same IBM Watson cloud or Microsoft Azure or IBM Hyperledger for blockchain. But it is the ecosystem which plays a role in bringing together banks, fintechs, regulators, venture capital, all of these together. And that is where I'm delighted to share that gift our Global Impact FinTech Forum, being a 65 country strong forum, plays a very important part in connecting these various stakeholders of the ecosystem. And that's why we are very delighted to continue working and partnering closely with the Economic Times and ET Markets, because we genuinely believe that this is not a winner takes all or even a one winner versus loser kind of an approach. Banks have now realized that they cannot coexist. They cannot exist independently of fintechs and vice versa. And regulators have realized they have to work with all these stakeholders together. VCs have realized this. Even universities and academia. And as I said, one of the hats I wear is that of an academic. So it's all coming together. Early days, but it's coming together. Then let me go to the F. I know we've seen this dramatically in many countries, including India, in Southeast Asia, in Singapore, you name it, in Singapore, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in Vietnam, in Thailand, in the Philippines. Amazing stuff happening in Korea, in North Asia as well. And of course, everybody knows about the 800-pound gorilla in the room when it comes to payments, and these 4S, which is basically China, the big two, WeChat and Alipay, and how they changed the payments landscape forever through creating, a chat platform became the largest payments platform in the world in 10 years. Who would have thought, right? And for somebody like me, who's been a banker for 2 decades, who would have thought? But it's essentially driven by these 4 Fs, or these 4 forces. Transactions are becoming faster, and not just faster. Now the de facto is becoming real time. And I must say that India has always been a leader for a long time on this. Like when I moved out of India in 2006 or so, about 15 years back, and I went to other countries in Southeast Asia, I was quite surprised about how certain things we took for granted even then in terms of NEFT, etc. And this is the pre-UPI era. Real-time payments were par for course. Even then, and now even today, certain countries in Southeast Asia are struggling with real-time payments, but we are getting there, whether it is PromptPay in Thailand or PayNow, of course, in Singapore is a classic example, or InstaPay in the Philippines. And of course, as I said, the private players, the Kakao Pays of the world, or the WeChat Pays, and Alipay in China. It's happening across. And of course, we're seeing a lot of action now happening in Africa as well. We are scheduled to have a discussion with one of these emerging Pan-Africa payment switches and networks, which will simplify this thing. So it's not just about faster and real-time payments. It's also making transactions frictionless. It's making it finance and money is becoming fun. And of course, freemium is a model which has been around for a long time. On frictionless, we'll discuss more in the conversation, but it's been a fascinating time. In the last, I think, few weeks alone, we've seen so many announcements of cross-border collaborations between MAS in Singapore and Thailand central banks. So PayNow and PromptPay bridge, Singapore and Malaysia bridge, Singapore and Philippines bridge, Philippines and I think one more UAE bridge as well. So it's really becoming, now the regulators are coming to a point where they are getting serious about making transactions faster, cheaper, or at least affordable, and reducing the friction in this. And one more thing which is fascinating is this fun aspect of it. Finance, one of the fifth F, finance was never associated with gamification and fun, but thanks to fintechs, thanks to cryptos, thanks to this whole community of millennials, including my 20-year-old nephew, who hang around at Reddit forums into like Wall Street Bets. They've really made a game out of everything from stock market investing to crypto investing, and then they have their own, really they have their own world, and they have their own icons of Elon Musk and Cathy Wood. So there's a Papa Musk and there's a Mama Cathy, and what they say really moves the markets just by one tweet. I mean, these things happen, but it's fascinating to see how millions of these people aggregate, and this whole idea of meme stocks and game stunk becoming a something in the mainstream. It's something that Wall Street is also discussing, those stiff suit and tie Wall Street bankers. So it's a fascinating time of how this is evolving, and how the next 10 years of finance and money will look nothing like the previous 10, forget the previous 50 years. And underlying all of these, as we discussed, are the PQR, especially the PNR policies and regulations. Again, we'll discuss it in more detail in our chat, but I did want to highlight one thing, that policies are at a point where they are playing dual or often different and competing roles, if I may say. So on the one hand, I have seen fintech policy and blockchain policy being one of the biggest enablers of this whole explosion in fintech and blockchain and crypto, whether it is in Singapore or Hong Kong or Dubai or London or Berlin, but even emerging countries like the Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia. It's fascinating, and I interact a lot, and I support a lot of these central bankers and regulators and agencies like ADB, etc. So I'm sharing first-hand perspectives and not second-hand, hearsay kind of thing. They have been extremely open-minded, extremely. I mean, I must say that at times they feel more open-minded than even many of the commercial banks I kind of interact with, or my former banking colleagues. But now then we are also seeing maybe early signs of a reverse, or I would call it not reverse, but a normal maturing trend, which is actually being played out in both the West in the USA and Europe, but also in the East, Far East in China. And again, I'll not go into the politics of it because it's a sensitive topic, especially when you utter the big C word. But I was joking with a friend of mine recently, and I said, perhaps the only thing that the US and China policymakers seem to agree upon these days is, hey, we need to clamp down on the power of our, or we need to seriously regulate our big techs, without any further delay. This is the only thing. If they were, if they were trying to find a common meeting ground, US, Europe, and China would probably not just agree, but give tips to each other on this. And we've seen what has been dubbed as the last 1 year of ongoing clampdowns in China. I have a slightly different view. I don't think it's a clampdown. It's a logical evolution of regulations, but everything, it's not just about what we saw when the Ant IPO, which was supposed to be the largest fintech in the world and the largest IPO, was pulled out last minute in last October, before it was about to be listed. But what is the story? You should always, and I'm saying this with the utmost respect. I know we are doing this with our media partners, but I do believe you should always discount a lot of noise from the media, because most of these people who write in media have no clue what they're writing about. So this endless regurgitating of China clampdown, this, that, US Senate being, they have no clue of what is happening underneath the surface. And we are fortunate in GIFT, we have real experts where we discuss, what is really happening beneath the surface. So the fact, for example, that the Chinese regulators and PBOC is telling Alibaba and Ant, hey, you want a list? That's fine, but clean up your house. You cannot have a, or we cannot have a scenario, both as a country and as a finance ecosystem, where you fund 2 to 4% of the loans and the remaining 96% keeps going on the bank's books, and we create another credit bubble after having learned our lessons and felt the pain in 2008, 2009 GFC. And we are just seeing what is happening in China with the Evergrande, crisis. There is already so much debt in the system. I think the regulators are extremely prudent, whether it is China or India or even Singapore or US in their own way. They obviously operate in their own way on not allowing credit bubbles to form, or around data sovereignty, data privacy, around not just customer rights, but something important which very few talk about when we get so carried away with this whole hype of tech and innovation. Contractor rights, right? So much of the new tech industry is taking away jobs, established jobs, and it's not replacing it with jobs. It is replacing it with contract workers, whether it's your Uber driver or your, the guy who delivers your Flipkart shipment or Amazon shipment or brings food at your place. Already they are, they are probably moving 1 or 2 notches lower in the value chain of the kind of job they do. And then they are not guaranteed by any employment benefits, etc. So obviously we saw how the Chinese regulators called guys from Meituan, which is the largest food delivery platform like Food Panda or whatever is there in India, or Grab or Gojek in Southeast Asia, and said, you have to take care of your contract workers as well. You can't just use and throw and it's all that Wild West coming in again. So I think a lot of what we are missing underneath this endless media, chatter and nonsensical same regurgitation of the headlines, is that a lot of these things are going to be important, good, useful, and required for society in the coming years. Otherwise, it's not just China, even in India and elsewhere, I'm willing to bet there will be social chaos if these things are not. I mean, you can't just have a situation where all the power, and we've seen this in India, right? Occasionally we've seen the Uber drivers go on strike, etc. We don't talk about it much because we are still in probably an earlier phase. But at some point or the other, this reality will have to be faced by policymakers, regulators in India and Southeast Asia and elsewhere as well. And finally, on the QR code, it's not really understood or appreciated much in India, as I said, because it's not a big factor thanks to UPI. But if you go to markets in Southeast Asia or even parts of North Asia and Korea, etc., you go to Thailand, you go to Indonesia, you go to Philippines, you go to Vietnam, you get out of the airport, you'll see QR code, those tent cards, or you can scan it from your phone. Why is it important, and why have I included it as along with regulations and other big things? Because I spent a large part of my career as a banker driving electronic payments. So I've been involved in this space for 20 years before the Squares and the Stripes of the world were even born, well before that. And one of the challenges we had, and it's not that as bankers and banks, we didn't want to make payments more widespread, and we didn't like the term financial inclusion. We didn't want to make it inclusive or forget ubiquitous. But because the whole model was centered around point of sale terminals, last mile, etc., it was a very now it seems like a very inefficient model, but there was no alternative to it. And therefore, if you are going to deploy a $200 point of sale terminal, you cannot sign up your Kirana shop or the equivalent in other countries like your sari store in the Philippines. Your economics will never work. But now with the QR code, hey, look, you don't need to have this $200 machine. There's just a simple tent card. It's zero cost, or probably just the cost of printing it. So that's why it's become, it's made it ubiquitous. Last mile outreach has become easier. It's obviously become much cheaper. As I said, this is an example, a classic example of innovation that people don't talk about, exponential innovation and disruption. It's reduced and crashed costs by 99.9%, but people don't talk about it. And therefore, it's opened up a market of these little salons, these little sari stores, these little coffee shops, people who come and do delivery. There's a lot of enablement of financial inclusion through this. And finally, as I said, I've tried to complete this within 20 or 25 minutes, but I do want to take a couple of minutes or 5 minutes to talk about the challenges, because the fintech and the blockchain and the crypto industry and the big tech industry has grown so fast across so many dimensions. And I've only covered certain aspects through this vocabulary. I could actually create an entire A to Z, and we could discuss this for 4 hours and still have a lot of time left. But because so much is happening, we are seeing this gap, and it's not just perhaps in India. In fact, India has more digital or tech talent, and Manish himself is an entrepreneur, so he understands, than many other parts of the world. But there's a gap in country after country after country. And I'm saying, again, I'm sharing this from first-hand experience because I was involved in working with central banks and regulators in a couple of countries, and on projects which were funded and supported by the World Bank on national digital talent development policy papers. And we've come up with a lot of evaluation and analysis, and also some recommendations on how the skills gap can be taken care of. So there are two aspects to it. One is that with the fast growing fintech and big tech and blockchain and crypto industry, you talk to founders after founders, and I have so many of them as former colleagues and friends. It's not easy to get great talent. And I'm not talking about just some developer, etc. I'm talking about creating a full team, right? Banks have and had probably some of the best talent. They could go to the IIMs, or in Philippines in AIMs, or in China there's Zhejiang universities, etc., and recruit the best of talent and create. Their structure came over decades, right? And I was fortunate to work in a bank like Citi, where I felt privileged to work with some of the best talent, whether in credit, in risk, in operations, in technology. The bureaucracy aside, the talent pool was really deep and rich. You don't find the same thing in fintechs or big techs. One is, of course, the cost, but there simply isn't that talent supply available because it's such a new industry, and in crypto even more so. I mean, how many Solidity developers are out there? And that is just one little tiny thing I'm touching upon. The point is, there is one aspect of it, which is that the skill required for this explosive and exponential growth of the fintech, blockchain, crypto, big tech sector is there is always a demand supply gap, and it turns out to be this sad reality where the bigger players who have deeper pockets and more money to spend can afford the best talent. That's not how a healthy, and go back to the E, that's not how a healthy ecosystem should grow. So we are working with universities, we are working with the ecosystem, and that's where GIFT comes in as a very important player, because we work with all these stakeholders. It's not just a university thing. You can't change the courses overnight. I have launched and I teach a fintech course, but you can only do it, do so much through the academic route. It has to work with all the stakeholders coming together. On the other hand, because so many people, existing professionals, right, bankers of 20 years, etc., so many of my former banking colleagues all feel, and I'm saying this with utmost responsibility, 95% of them are anxious that in 5 years' time, either their roles will completely change or they'll get redundated. And they all come to me and say, Malik, you teach fintech, tell us I want to learn fintech. How do I start? That's actually where they start. I'm not kidding. And a classic example of that is Singapore, right? With the Skills Futures program that they have launched, which has become a national program. It's actually called Skills Futures, where people like Manish or me or all of us on this call who are people in their 40s or mid 40s who've spent 20 years, 25 years in traditional finance or even in digital finance in banking. So much of it is changing. They have to upskill, and the government there is proactively saying, hey, we are telling you where the world is headed. These are the roles you need to, or these are the skills you need to upskill yourself in. These are the programs we'll bring for you. And hey, guess what? We'll even fund you to the tune of 90%. Now I understand that's unique. It's Singapore, small country, city, state, island nation, can't be replicated at scale in larger countries like India or China or even Philippines, etc. But it's a model and a template which I think is important. So two things here when it comes to digital skills and talent. One, there is a gap for the existing needs of the fintechs and the big techs and the crypto industry. Two, the existing employees who've spent most of their life in certain industries and a certain way of working are afraid they'll get redundated in 3 to 5 years, and rightly so. So you have to find a solution to both these challenges. And it's not just about those lofty pronouncements that, hey, we need to teach STEM from school, etc. There has to be a much deeper thinking and a much more structural solution to this. And some of what we covered, finally, I'll end with the UNV, does try and address this ongoing challenge of the underbanked and unbanked. And for, as much as we may say, this continues to be a problem in and a significant problem in most emerging markets. So I also wanted to leave us with the thought of the we, and we've seen this explosion of virtual bank licenses in Asia in the last at least a couple of years. Korea, Taiwan, Malaysia, Singapore, Hong Kong, now Philippines, they've all issued virtual banking licenses. Is this just another thing in the journey of fintech and the change of financial services, or is this something which can really structurally solve for financial inclusion? Because it really changes the way a bank operates, right? It doesn't have physical branches, it's lower cost, lower capex, lower opex, and therefore you can run a more efficient entity. You can also open accounts. You don't have to do face-to-face KYC. You just use your phone and do a video KYC or use a selfie. So many things that I want us to explore here. Well, with that, we come to the end. This is a little bit about myself. Anybody who's interested can reach out to me on LinkedIn. Otherwise, we work quite closely on an ongoing basis with our partners at ET and ET Markets. Thank you, and I'm happy and open for a deeper discussion on some of these elements.
Thank you. We started living in a digital world, and we were found digitally, movements were run digitally, and revolts happened digitally, and everything was happening at an exponential proportion because everyone was available digitally. So for example, I think if I were to contrast this with a globe trotting Malik, and if I had to get your time to get on a digital call or a virtual conference when you were, flying all this while, and you didn't have time, physically available to you. I think we were much more available. Malik was there, and we could do a lot more, in that sense. So the paradigm has kind of changed, and that helped a lot of fintechs also rise during this time. So coming to the next step, we did discuss, GameStop and all that, which is interesting. Explain me, how do you see the rise of all assets? I mean, this is again, something that has never happened. I know I'm not talking to an economist, and the idea is not to corner you on that. The idea is what's happening? Are we really dreaming, as you said? Are we dreaming digital today, or is it just a game? Is it fun? That stocks are moving, gold is moving, all kinds of assets are moving, Bitcoin, Ether, everything at the same time.
That's an excellent question and observation, and something that a lot of very, very serious senior Nobel Prize winning economists are asking and trying to get us to reflect on it. So I'm a very small fry as compared to them, so I won't claim to be an expert, or nor am I an economist by training or profession, but I've spent a long time in the financial services industry like you. So I'll try and give my 2 cents on that. So you are right, it is being called as the everything bubble. And just for context and caveat, Manish, this is not the first time it's happening. For those of us who lived to 99, 2000, there was a very eerie similarity, almost, as I said, this almost seems like a bad dream or a dystopian reality being played out all over again with a new generation and a new set of players. But to me, the script seems too familiar. I was in fact, an internet.com entrepreneur then. Replace .com in 99, 2000 with everything crypto or NFT. Now you will, or meme stock, you get the story. So one is, I think we all understand what's fueling this is the easy money supply from central banks all over the world, of course, starting with the Fed. And now we are beginning to see signs of both a divergence and something like of this coming perhaps from mid-cycle change, if not an end. And we saw, not a maybe steep correction, but a significant correction over the last few days and weeks in all markets. India has somehow stayed immune, but I'm sure sooner or later it has to catch up. So China has crashed and Hong Kong have crashed hard, but you see what's happening not just in the Dow Jones and S&P and even NASDAQ. It's not just that 7-8% correction. Underneath the surface, there are companies and stocks which have corrected by 30, 40, 50%, including crypto stocks. So if you are trying to, let's say, buy Coinbase as a proxy for Bitcoin and crypto, because their price, it very closely correlates to that price. We've seen Coinbase down by more than 50% from its post IPO levels. So there is a churn which is happening. The era of easy money has bound to come to an end, and this bubble of everything will obviously is already beginning to collapse. So I won't say it will collapse. Underneath the surface, there's a lot of rumbling going on for months now. In fact, it's not just happening yesterday.
No, I'll correlate with that. So one of my companies is in real estate, fractional ownership of real estate, and there is no way that the way these stocks and markets are rising, beyond a point, I started saying, sorry, real estate cannot compete. So the asset, just even if you bring in the safest of the asset, nobody wants to be safe nowadays. It appears, and the asset itself, many of these assets actually have lost luster, because of the kind of growth. I don't think FDs can compete. I don't think stabler investments just can't compete with what is happening in terms of growth rates being available, very cheap, very digital, and sitting at home doing nothing.
You're absolutely spot on. So whether it is traditional and safer, steadier investments, if I may say so, like real estate or even gold for that matter, right? For the longest time, for generations now, in fact, and even in our generation, gold was seen as the hedge against inflation. So whenever we've seen this, and there has been this worry about inflation, which is creeping all over the world, right? So gold should have rallied. It's not. Why? Because now people are saying, hey, Bitcoin is the hedge to inflation fueled by cheap money. So if you actually study uh, 80 to, or I don't know what is the percentage, there is a significant chunk of the flows which should have gone into gold in the normal course, or perhaps even real estate. But let's say real estate may be seen as correlated with the economy and inflation, but gold is seen as a natural hedge. It did not, because a large part of that fund went to crypto. So you're right, there is a, between the socio-cultural element, between technology, between gamification, we are seeing trends which we've never ever seen. At the same time, I just want to conclude this with the point I made earlier. To me, and for a lot of observers like us who've been in the markets and in the trenches for a long time, the story does seem familiar. Every bubble comes to an end. Every bubble, from the tulip mania to the dot-com mania. So I think viewer caution and sensible approach is warranted. Gamification and all are structural trends which are here to stay, but they will go through their corrective phase before the next leg up.
Yeah, I think, in the gamification world, we can take examples from, from the slot machines and, those houses. The house always wins, so.
Exactly, the house always wins.
Correct. So, it probably would have been a good time for anybody who created a fintech and got listed. And I think that was the perfect timing to make it both ways. You had customers and you had,
right, Manish, we've seen the number of fintech listings. These are all signs of a late stage hype, right? You see, it's not just the Coinbase of the world or the Coupangs of the world in Korea or Ant trying to go for a $300 billion IPO. So many of them, I think Toast and others, many others have gone for an IPO across the world, and we've seen that IPO flurry in India as well, right? So these are signs people are capitalizing when they sense that the party is about to get over.
Yeah, and in India, so one of the biggest fintech, Paytm, is very well expected to list, and expectedly at a high premium. Coming back to a very different subject, which is close to your heart, again, regulation of fintechs. And financial services. I think more and more financial services will start resembling fintech as we go along, as banks kind of open up. How do you think it is evolving? Because as in your note you talked about that there are different trends emerging in let's say advanced fintech nations, like and in that sense China and US are in the same boat, as well as mid nations which still have room for a lot of fintech evolution. So they may go light touch, to begin with, and many countries who still are grappling with the idea of fintech, where the regulators are still at stage 3, so to say. How do you think this is evolving? It's a very interesting field.
That's a great question. I'm glad you asked. I tried to briefly cover it during my presentation, but I just want to say something. Manish, you put it very well, saying that banks are increasingly looking like fintechs because of open banking and both top down and bottom up. So regulators saying, hey, open up, stop your monopolies. And we just saw something which was unthinkable even 2 years back in China, right? Because of this, both Alipay and WeChat have opened their walled gardens to each other, something which was unprecedented, really. I mean, 1 billion users being opened up to each other. So yes, between open finance, open banking, regulations at the top, and customer demand as a bottom-up force, we are seeing banks behaving more and more like fintechs. But I'm also seeing the early signs of a exactly opposite trend, that fintechs will start looking more and more like banks as well. And I gave this example, and I keep giving this example of China again and again, because I think we really need to understand what's happening underneath all the noise and the cacophony. One of the big things, as I said, one of the key not even sticky points, the things that the regulators told Ant is, you will now become a financial holding company. And yes, because of that, its valuation supposedly has been cut from 300, 350 to anywhere from 200 to, some people say, even 150 billion in half. But that's exactly the point they are seeing, that now you've become too big to fail. Earlier it was banks. We saw the result of too big to fail letting go unchecked in 2008 and 2009. It started in the US then, but we saw a global contagion, a global spiral. This time it may start in China, but and Evergrande is already causing some ripples in the global market. So I think there are these two forces of banks opening up more and more, and both within GIFT, we have members from these banks, but also from our former banking community, banks like DBS, etc. in Singapore. They're really going all the way in plugging into the fintech ecosystem, thinking like fintechs, even developing platforms and operating like fintechs on the one hand, and creating open ecosystems beyond their walled gardens. Early days, I'm not saying banks are simply opening the door, early days yet. But on the other hand, we are seeing this reverse trend where in more developed markets, whether it is Facebook Libra, and we saw the pushback coming in, and then the whole idea, in fact, CBDCs, I claim very categorically, this whole growth in the last 18 months was a response to the Facebook challenge. It's as simple as that. And I have been at many conferences where I've seen the deputy governors of central banks stand up on stage when Libra was announced and say, we will not allow Libra to come to this country. And you and I both understand and agree, right, that the exponential rise of CBDCs was a direct result of this. So whether it is Facebook or whether it is the big techs in China, and we saw something interesting happen yesterday, which again, see, important things go unnoticed. Media never evaluates because they are always busy talking about scoops and hype. Google withdrew its fintech plans, right, in the US, and we were discussing
that is something that I was going to ask you exactly next. And let me ask that alongside this question, so you can sum it up together. One is, on the regulation front, I would also like you to bring forth how regulators are changing, because you work with quite a few. So I think one of the best regulators that I have seen is MAS, and the exemplary way in which they have come across and started creating APIs. I mean, you don't think that was never the classic regulation as we were used to, but they started building digital infrastructure of sorts, so that it becomes an equal opportunity play for everyone in some sense, and it fosters their goal of innovation, etc. So the regulators coming outright, not just for enabling, they coming outright and creating infrastructure by themselves. They're investing in them. In fact, they have a fund to invest in fintechs. That's one part I would like you to cover. And number two is the whole thing about, now that there are some fintechs who have become too big, and there are some big older fintechs, let's put it, the senior fintechs, who now see a threat to their business model. They ignored it for some time, I guess, but they are waking up. The giants and the gorillas are waking up. The incumbents were having sleepless nights. I think they have come a long way to really challenging the next wave of innovation. So incumbents versus innovators, give some light on that in terms of, let's say Visa, Swift, and even Google, like you said, Google shelved some of the products because now the TechFin and fintech play is kind of at cross paths, for itself. So very interesting there. Again, back to you.
Thank you, Manish. And I think whenever you talk about regulations, or we talk about regulations, MAS has to be mentioned. It's also an interesting thing for me personally, and also a somewhat pleasant thing that Swapnendu, who is the Chief FinTech Officer and one of the driving forces of this over the last 5 years at MAS, is also my former city colleague from the same group. So he comes from that. In fact, it was the very starting point, if you think of it, that the regulator in Singapore brought in somebody from the other side to head, not just come in, but head their fintech business, was a big signal in itself that they want to change and they will walk the talk. It's not just announcements. True. And Manish, while everybody sees and talks about MAS, and of course MAS and Swapnendu are quite visible in the work they've done, again, we have to see a little bit under the surface as well. And I touch briefly upon MAS's initiatives, but what is important, and I had invited Swapnendu as a guest speaker at one of my classes as well, and just a couple of weeks back, he had presented, and we were discussing this before these announcements were made official. A lot of these cross-border initiatives are two important things that I saw here. One is, while MAS has been like this exemplary regulator, which has almost mastered that impossible art of a very robust financial system, with innovation at the cutting edge, at the leading edge. It almost seems too good to be true. But the big thing now over the last few weeks and months is all these cross-border connections that I spoke about. Pay Now, Prompt Pay, Pay Now Malaysia, now we saw Pay Now India, and these MCD or multiple CBDC bridges between South Africa, Singapore, Thailand, UAE central banks. So what we are seeing is not just innovation by central banks, but pooling together by central banks. That is one key trend which we never saw at that level. So it's not just, again, underneath the surface, what is happening in Indonesia with Bank Indonesia and OJK. I work very closely with them. Bank of Thailand, amazing stuff, both with their, live project, Inthanon and Lion Rock, their CBDC project, as well as the success of Prompt Pay, or something that you would not even probably associate in the same breath, Cambodia, the National Bank of Cambodia, Madam Serechia, and the work she and her team have done, amazing stuff. They didn't have a financial or a payments infrastructure or platform, forget like India, but even Thailand or Philippines. So what did they do? What did she say with her team and with Swapnendu and others while discussing? Okay, if you have to create something new, let's create it on blockchain. And that's how Project Bakong was born. When you don't have something, don't replicate existing systems, go out for the best. So, the fact that a country like Cambodia can come up with one of the first amazing sustainable national level payment systems being built, it's, to me, it's almost as path-breaking as this example I gave you of this rural bank, Cantillan Bank in the Philippines. Sometimes you see innovation coming in from the most unexpected of places. So that is one. There is a lot of activity, or we saw just 2 weeks back, GIFT Nigeria chapter had organized this event with our partners in Nigeria, along with the Central Bank of Nigeria, where the Central Bank of Nigeria announced the launch of their retail CBDC, right? The eNaira project. And everybody talks about digital yuan or the Bahamas, but even in Africa, regulators have gone out and launched it, not just discussing architecture, solutions, etc. So we are seeing innovation, I won't say in the most unlikeliest of places, but it's a broader spectrum. In the developed financial centers, you would have expected it. Now you are seeing it all over the world. And again, in India, it was to a certain extent, in my mind, it's expected because RBI has always been to my mind, a standout regulator, but it's happening in Argentina, in Colombia, and all over the world, and probably, at least for the masses, unlikeliest of places. The other important thing that you said is, now we've seen another important thing which Swapnendu mentioned in that session, Project Parthior, right? So they've created Project Ubin phases 1 to 5, created this whole CBDC platform in phases, tested it, brought in different use cases. What are they doing now? They've handed it over to the industry. And Swapnendu calls it a classic example of public good. So they've, as you said, they've actually created infrastructure as a public good, like probably UPI did in India, but UPI has not, NPCI has not left ceded control or given it. They're bringing in private players, but they still tightly control it, right? MAS is saying, okay, this is for the industry, Project Parthior. And we just saw, I think 2 days back, the announcement of a new CEO for Parthior, Jason Thompson. So they've actually brought in a payments veteran to run that Parthior. And it's as we know, it's a kind of a joint initiative where multiple banks, DBS, JP Morgan, etc. So it's fascinating. I'm seeing these two trends of cross-border collaboration at a deeper level than ever before. And it's not just the big players or the big boys.
To some extent, India also had this. UPI wouldn't have worked if it was probably in any other format. I think so all these trends, and RBI very quickly rose up to the UPI monolith architecture, and they kind of opened the whole thing again to multiple UPI-like players, to come in. So technology not to be monolithically controlled. It's something that you can test for a while, and you open up the market for licensing, and the regulator steps back to regulation in some sense. So yes, that's very interesting as a trend. What do you say about incumbents versus innovators? The new innovator incumbent versus the
lot has been said, but again, as I said, to me, a very important development which amidst all the noise, nobody even discussed about it, and we discussed it a lot in group in our GIFT forums and channels just 2 days back, was Google pulling out after all the noise and the hype, and everybody was saying big techs, the US big techs are going to be like the Chinese big techs. I'm not saying big techs will not maybe hurt the banks even more or going forward, but there was, and this is my assessment. I'm not claiming this is how and why Google did it. This is just my assessment based on what I see and having worked with Google in my earlier avatar when they were selling ads to us at Citi, but also thanks to the benefit of all the experts we have at GIFT and the various nuanced perspectives. See, Google makes pots of money through their advertising platforms, and we all know that financial services along with travel are probably the two biggest industry, and maybe now e-commerce. And they've been selling this for years, probably more than a decade. They used to sell it to me in 2006 and 7. So they're already making a lot of money. They're already completely, not just in bed with, but they almost like have the power equation is so skewed that they dominate. The banks pay them whatever they want because of the auction model, right? And we used to gripe and crib a lot, but whatever the Google auction model says, you pay cost per click or now cost. They've also gone into cost per lead. They've created this very interesting model with banks. It's no longer just about branding and advertising. You get real customers from that. So now I'm thinking, if you have a model, and this probably, as I said, was in my view was this internal, and I'm trying to spice it up for our viewers, but perhaps this would have been played out in some way or the other. So there's this internal group which drives revenues and monetization and ad sales, etc., which says, hey, why do you want to do it? I'm anyway giving you, I'm juicing out the financial services industry as much as I can, and I'm giving millions of new customers to the financial services industry. So what's the big point of killing your own cash cow? Then there are these moonshot divisions, etc., which Google has become famous for, or the fintech play, which says, no, we want to go in the last mile connectivity with the customers as well. We want to have this vertical integration. And maybe in hindsight, whoever in their senior management or CFO, etc., would have said, what is the additional incremental benefit in going the fintech route and losing a lot of our existing banking partners and players and customers and revenues for future growth? And again, this is not to say it may not change, because strategies evolve and change, but to me, it was probably a bird in hand, two in the bush. Incremental benefit of something like this versus what they were getting and the trade-offs would not have made sense. Now, again, you have to see and really discriminate. Facebook did something similar, but they went the full distance and they even altered it, right? Libra became Diem, but that was completely a breakthrough. Facebook was not extending its advertising model to create a new bank.
That was not cannibalizing on its own revenue.
That was digital money. They were becoming the global central bank, and that's why central banks became so wary. That was a completely different model. So you have these two models by two big techs, and then we've discussed enough about China, so I won't repeat. But you have a third model where the Chinese big techs became so big in fintech that now the regulators are telling, okay, become like a bank. You want to do your IPO, be regulated like a bank.
If I may, I'll again bring your attention to the giants like Visa and Swift. And when I say that, this is interesting because Visa has been a micropayment giant, and Visa is challenging again with its own large ecosystem, connects, etc. And it has become a very nimble, different Visa now. And Swift again redefining itself and coming all together in a very different way. I've been observing this, and we have been looking at when we are building fintech marketplaces. I need a lot of solutions which are around cross-border and payments and things like that. Both of these solutions are very refreshing, and I in fact made a comment on Swift that thank God you woke up, to some of these, and they are making cross-border payments very, very easy, and micro payments and cross-border payments a lot swifter. Again, coming back to point, was this not something that they should have done earlier? They should have probably, but fintechs may have threatened now to a point that they had to wake up. What happens to Payoneer? What happens to if Swift becomes efficient? Why do you need the project Ubin? In some sense. So what's going to happen?
You asked me a very tricky question, and let's, I'll be very transparent and candid as far as possible. So I was moderating two panels, not around the same time, but these are two stories of, you bring it. So on one panel, I had representatives from Swift on one hand and Ripple on the other. So the classic incumbent and disruptor kind of model. And I won't go into the partly gory details of what transpired. And on the other hand, again, going back to MAS and Supnendu, when I was chatting with him and when I was asking these questions during my session, and even last week at this Nigeria summit, one of the panelists was Khuntan Saya from, she runs the CBDC group at the Bank of Thailand. So I asked her the same question as well. So there are these three forces, right? There is Swift, which is the global messaging service, which has been around, maybe not the most efficient, but it is as ubiquitous as can get, and really the backbone. Then you have, and maybe you can take an equivalent of Visa and MasterCard on the payment side, card side of things. Then you have these Ripples of the world, the disruptors coming in through the tokenized platform and saying, hey, Swift is inefficient. I am going to show how cross-border fund transfer can be made efficient. And then you have the MAS and private banks and Partior and these cross-border, and BIS also getting involved with the MCBDC bridge. We were having these conversations with Benedict as well, right? Who was also part of our GIFT policy makers working group. So I see these three forces connected yet distinct, trying to work in similar spaces. And as you said, on the one hand, you actually see regulators taking a participative public goods role in trying to solve for this problem. They said, this is a real problem. Cross-border payments are inefficient. They are, and go back to the 4Fs, right? They need to become faster, frictionless, maybe not fun, but at least freemium or cheaper. So faster, cheaper, more transparent. Ripple on the other side is trying to do the same, saying, this is inefficient. And then you have Swift reinventing itself as well. And I asked the same question. That was just when Swift, through, I don't know what it was called, they had the particular name for that initiative. They had also piloted doing this on blockchain. I think GPI or something.
Yeah.
Pardon if I got the name, the acronym incorrect, but that was just when they were going into it. And I asked the same question to both of them. That hey, Swift is this behemoth in which all banks are plugged in, and now it is also using blockchain to cut down the actual messaging transfer time from maybe a couple of days or 3 days to 3 hours, or probably even 50-60 minutes. It may not be real time, but frankly, if you and I send money all over the world, corporate, 60 minutes or even end of day is reasonably good enough, right? As long as it is it's transparent.
It is trusted, it is there, and it has the network already. So no fintech can match that, and now it has the efficiency.
Correct. So that's why I say we are living in, again, unprecedented times where the regulators are building their own solution towards the same objective. Swift has already gone into a major course correction, and it's not just theory, Manish. I'm sure you've noticed it. Our friends here from ET have noticed it. I have definitely noticed it when moving money around. It comes the next day. From a local bank in India to my accounts in Singapore or Philippines, it comes the next day. Earlier, there was no way in the world it would come the next day. At least 2 days or 3 days. So it's okay. I'm okay. Next day payments is most people in businesses, etc., would be okay. It's not real time. It's not tokenized. It doesn't go into your wallet.
I create capital markets, so T+1 is just fine.
Correct. So I see this. I don't know whether they will all coexist, or at some point they will, they will have this extended version of Partior where, private and public sector will come together, or they will genuinely compete, or they will find their spaces and niches for each other. I don't have, the answer, and I can't do crystal ball gazing, but I do want to say it's the most fascinating time. We've never seen this time where we've had this confluence of three forces: the incumbent reinventing, the disruptor going all guns blazing, and the regulator coming into the mix.
Yeah, so this is interesting, and I did. I had an itch to ask you questions on this along. Now, coming back to your other favorite subject about. Before I go to exciting things like CBDCs and NFTs, I would go to a more deeper subject about financial inclusion. So, is capitalism and fintech investment, led capitalism working for everyone?
It's a tricky question, Manish, and it depends on, honestly, like I spoke about crypto, it kind of brings in a little bit of that religious or certainly a socio-cultural aspect to it, because you cannot address this question in isolation purely from an economic lens. But I'll try and give as balanced a view as I can. So we go back to this thing we were discussing right before this, right? These three forces of the regulator, the incumbent, and the disruptor. And you look at it, they are all trying to solve essentially for the same problem. I gave examples of you and I, but honestly, you and I, if I may be very blunt, could afford $10, $20 extra or $50 extra on a transaction and an extra day. I mean, it didn't threaten our lives or livelihoods or impact our finances to that great an extent. Now it's like become better. We are happy. We will be happier if it becomes the same day and shaves up another $10, $20, $30. But it was not, dramatically changing for us individually or for our businesses. But let's take the simple example, and I give this because I'm currently in the Philippines, so it's a logical example to give. Philippines exports, its biggest export is people, right? All over the world, similar with Indonesia and Mexico, etc. And a lot of these people work as caregivers or house domestic help, etc. in places all over the Middle East or US, but also let's say Singapore, something. And I've lived in both these countries, so I can give this example firsthand. So Singapore, for those of you who are familiar with the geography, there's a mall on Orchard, not the most high-end mall, but it's quite a well-known mall called Lucky Plaza. And Lucky Plaza, unlike the high-end malls of Ion Orchard, etc., is frequented by these Filipino and Indonesian domestic workers who go there as maids, etc., or house help or nannies. They probably earn sub $1,000 a month, which is big by Philippines or Indonesia or Vietnam standards or Myanmar standard. And they get 1 day off in a week, Sunday. What do? They spend half their or maybe 3-4 hours standing in the line at one of these remittance stores, fill up a form, and probably send to $300, $400. They pay cash over the counter, and the money then comes to these kind of small money changer shops or pawn shops in Philippines or Indonesia, etc. And for sending $400, they would probably get charged $30 or $20. Now, as I said, when we send a few $1,000, you and I profile of users, $40 to $20. Okay, no, everybody likes to save $20, but it's 0.3% getting shaved or 0.5% getting reduced to 0.4%. But for these guys, it is 5, 6, 7, 8%. And that is where, when Swapnendu and Tansaya say this, it hits home hard, because I've seen this firsthand, and I live on the other side now in the Philippines. It saves so much time for these overseas Filipino workers. It saves cost, and $40 on $400 is 10%, mind you. So half of that is 5% saved. Hard, your blood, sweat, and tears, not just rounding off a happy feeling. So this is where we are seeing these developments genuinely driving and focused on financial inclusion. It's not just hype, it's not just talk, which you hear it. And I've spoken at dozens of financial inclusion conferences. I'm a big skeptic, let me be blunt about it. Most of the multilateral agencies, especially the ones, and I'm being very blunt here, but pardon me, those my friends who are hearing this, the ones who are in Washington, DC, Washington, DC, etc., they don't get it. They really don't get it. And I've said this on their face. You can't be talking about financial inclusion sitting in Washington, DC or Singapore. Let's be blunt about it. In a country like Singapore, where each person has 2 cards and the bank is offering you a 3rd card and a 3rd bank account, you may say all you want at conferences, you'll never understand exclusion unless you've lived and grown up in India and lived and worked in Philippines or Indonesia or Mexico or Nigeria, etc. Or people sitting in DC and Ivory Towers will not get it. So that is one. But on the other hand, I think this, as I said, I hate some of this because it gets thrown about too loosely for too many things. Now, let me take a very blunt view of this again. And Manish, you are seeing a different side of me. I'm being, kind of blazing on a lot of the crypto folks. And I saw a report recently. I don't want to name names and all. And everybody is trying to do a business best wishes to them. As I said, I've seen this space for 10 years, even before many of these crypto exchange founders got into this space. So I've not just been an observer, but I have spoken at conferences all over the world, and I've seen many of these cycles, and I'm a believer in this. But that doesn't mean that I will allow any kind of whitewashing bullshit to go unchallenged. So I saw this report of how crypto will play a big role in fomenting and supporting the Indian economy and 1 million jobs and all. Or I don't know, whatever the number was. Give me a break. 1 million jobs in crypto exchanges. You and I both know, that's a pure PR piece. So without naming names, anybody who says cryptos are driving financial inclusion gets a very dirty look from me. Bitcoin at 50,000 is not a financial inclusion pay. In India, how much does it work out to? 35 lakhs, 38 lakhs for one Bitcoin. 38 lakhs means 37 lakhs still means if you go at the outskirts of Pune, you might be lucky to end up getting a 1-bedroom apartment, right?
Yeah.
So please don't tell me that crypto is doing a great thing and all this. Yes, tokenization has a role, as I said, Swift, Partior, Ripple, there is a role. If you cut down those $40 of transaction fees to $10 and $20 or $5, there's a very real financial inclusion aspect. But Bitcoin as digital gold, not financial inclusion. So please, we need to, and again, I'm saying this because we have our partners from Economic Times, which is the largest, and oldest and most reputed media group here. So I want to use this platform to tell people and also our partners at ET that we have to be responsible when we use these terms very loosely about financial inclusion. There's a lot of, and one could very well argue, right? Nouriel Roubini, one of the leading economists, he's hated at blockchain conferences because he speaks very bluntly about it. I may not agree with a lot of his views about crypto being an outright scam, but he says certain things that crypto is not needed for, or Bitcoin and these shit coins are not needed for financial inclusion. The Alibaba and the WeChats of the world have done just fine in China by bringing 1 billion users into the fold in China. Now, of course, it's a different story. They've become monopolies, but 5-7 years back, they were genuinely through closed platforms and non-traditional or non-disruptive platforms, they were achieving the objective. And that's why the regulators gave them a free run, that they were bringing in so many people into the financial fold, which banks could not service. And I have many friends from Citi, etc., who worked over there. They will tell you, a WeChat is everything. You can book your car, you can book your ticket. Paytm is trying to replicate that because they have an investment from Alibaba, of course, so they are learning from there. But you can do everything on that, and you can order your meals, etc. So through a single click. So that is technology for inclusion, bringing people into the fold who didn't have bank accounts, who frankly don't need bank accounts, or Gcash or PayMaya in the Philippines, 40 million users out of a country of 100 million. Now again, it could be debated on whether my house helper, would she rather have cash or would she have money going into her Gcash wallet? But at least there's a purpose. But please don't tell me 50,000 Bitcoin is financial inclusion and it's a great thing for society and it will create 1 million jobs. Okay, you can say that this is a wave of the future. You either ride with it or you wave it. At least present facts for what they are. Don't try to camouflage it under this feel-good nonsense.
So that brings me to a very interesting point, that compared to places where regulators came in early and they kind of stepped in, enabled the space, created the public digital highway for financial inclusion, they, I think, more often than not have created products and oriented the industry to create products which were used by mass millions. When I say that, I also include UPI in that fold. And since the regulator was behind it, the adoption is faster, and the purpose kind of gets oriented towards its end goal. Had the regulator been behind, or SEC, let's say, or been behind a Bitcoin, probably the result would have been different. But the moment it was Libra, it was the opposite of that, essentially. So I think so maybe that is the reason why whenever we have seen these things, and more initiatives from the regulators, I'm just trying to summarize from your points, Malik, is that maybe when the regulators are proactive, they have the ability to shape, some of the innovations in a way that it really affects, the implementation to be more financially inclusive and affordable.
And if I may just quickly add, we've discussed this, so I won't go into it again. But even when they're reactive, for example, most regulators are reactive to Libra. But look at how it's created this explosion of CBDCs, and the end outcome might be that between its new avatar as DM and all these CBDCs, there will be genuine financial inclusion being driven in many places. And I give this example of Cambodia and how blockchain and tokens are being used to create a new payment trail, which is faster, cheaper, easier. So yes, tokens can play a vital part in financial inclusion, but just not the way certain players want to position it.
So that is where I'm coming to the most, one of the most exciting areas.
And if I may, sorry, one more thing, Manish, compliments to you. For example, I think what you're trying to do at Grex is a classic example of inclusion, not maybe from a bottom of the pyramid perspective, but small, medium, micro, small, medium enterprises getting access to capital. In fact, I'm doing a project I can't share much because it's confidential with one of the leading development agencies in Asia and a regulator in Eastern Europe, which is exactly around this. How can you use innovative financial technology to enable access to capital for the medium, small, and micro enterprises? So it may not be your classical financial inclusion, which gets spoken about and discussed in the halls of Washington, DC, or in Singapore, etc. But this is financial inclusion, giving access to alternative capital.
Financial inclusion is a wide subject. I mean, and it has many, what we call target audiences, target groups. Now comes to the interesting part, which you alluded, and the CBDCs and digital assets and NFTs. I think somewhere before I ask you a question on the link between these two, I think I would like to have an independent view on how you see, CBDCs evolving alongside regulators' active, interest in creating something which otherwise may get created otherwise by players like Facebook.
See, again, while I have been very deeply involved in the CBDC space, and I'm advising quite a few central banks and regulators and observing many others, I also want to be equally, if I may say, and call a spade a spade. I've discussed this at many forums with central bankers as well. CBDCs is not a magic wand or a panacea, right? So just because you introduce CBDC doesn't mean you automatically have financial inclusion. We had this example and discussion on Singapore and MAS in public goods, but public goods only work where they, one, solve a real world problem, which we've seen in this case, and they will get consumed at scale. At scale is the key word here, and which is where I believe maybe we all understand that part of the crackdown in China was also because of PBOC launching its own digital money, digital yuan. So obviously they sense this. They're smart people, that if you have 1 billion users on Alipay and WeChat Pay, what's left for us, and why will they've already accomplished a large part of the inclusion task? Why will people, as much as it's a central bank money and central bank wallet, why will they come to us unless it's something bigger or better? And I've asked this question: what is the incentive for somebody to shift from their Alipay or WeChat Pay wallet to the digital yuan wallet? And I'm asking the same questions in Nigeria and elsewhere. So that's why I give that example of Cambodia. Where there is nothing, you create a solution that will become a game changer. But where you already have 1 billion users, or let's say you have UPI in India, which is almost as
this is exactly being asked in India as well. That
correct. So what will the digital rupee
why
achieve?
do we need that?
Correct. Yeah, and I think RBI is spot on by asking these questions. Or in the Philippines, it's the same question we are hearing. I had one of the conversations I had recently at one of these sessions was with the deputy governor and the head of the payments group at the Philippine Central Bank, BSP, again, a good friend. So I asked him these questions, and he had all of these points that we want to evaluate. We'll not simply carried away, because by the FOMO effect. Even regulators are humans, right? Not just people and fintechs, but even regulators have FOMO effect. Hey, 70% now, BIS says 70% of regulators are evaluating this. So should I jump into the bandwagon before I'm the last one? But no, it takes courage to say I will evaluate, like Bank of Japan did for a long time before they decided, or digital euro. You decide what purpose it will serve, what problems it will solve, and can it be adopted at scale. And perhaps these were the same questions they were trying to address in digital euro as well, or even in Thailand. And I've asked the same question to my friends in Bank of Thailand, and their answer is the same. So you see, this entire project, Inthanon and Lion Rock, was not a retail CBDC. It was a B2B wholesale CBDC, because prompt pay works just fine, like in China, like in India, like in many other countries. If you have a payment system which a large part of your country uses, it's real time, it's frictionless, it's even zero cost. In Thailand, it's free. Bank to bank, I mean, wallet to wallet transfer, or even between banks through prompt pay, it's free. So what is the additional benefit, either in terms of inclusion or those 3Fs or 4Fs, that CBDCs are going to bring? So it's important, at least for me, as and for us at GIFT, as active observers, ecosystem partners to central banks and the BISs and the IMFs of the world, all around the world, to bring these issues to the fore as well. That just because Facebook is saying I'll become a global central bank, and you pushed back, which was necessary and very timely and relevant, that can't mean that the answer is another knee jerk. So there have to be, you have to look at it case by case, context by context. Even Ubin, Singapore, look at what MAS did. And Swapnendu says this on public forums as well, that we have a great payment system in Pay Now. It serves all the purposes. So why will we go into retail Sing Dollar? What is the additional benefit for the cost? And that's why they created this whole B2B platform and part here and give it to the industry. So that's my take on this, Manish. I think RBI is taking a very good, prudent stand. In fact, I must compliment RBI for how it's approaching both its, and I know it's not a very popular thing to say on a crypto, amongst the crypto community, but I think your approach to crypto regulations, allowing it, not allowing it, and CBDCs, it has to be in the context of the realities of India. Just as
so how do you see this government's move, as much as we know it, that, and I wrote in 80 some time back that, the government may classify the, whole crypto world and crypto tokens into two kinds. One may be called the commodities, and the others may be called digital assets. The way I see it, government has not come out and very clearly specified what does it mean, but the way I see it is anything that has no underlying asset attached, so it doesn't derive its value because of a physical or underlying, pre-existing asset, will be a commodity, a digital commodity, like a Bitcoin, so to say. And maybe anything like when we create, let's say, real estate based tokens, that will be a classic example of a digital asset, or a digital asset based on NFTs for paintings. Those are based on a real valuable asset which otherwise also had value. You only have a tokenized representation of that. How do you see that? And in fact, when I read what the Indian government is trying to do, I was pretty refreshed myself that this is a very good take, on which is a progressive take on trying to bring things into some kind of fold. What do you think? What do you think about that?
That's a great point, Manish. And again, with all due respect to the crypto maximalists in India and those passionate folks who always reject everything government about crypto, I agree with you. It's refreshing, it's balanced, it's nuanced, it's well thought out, and that's exactly what the regulator should be doing, whether in India or China or the US or EU. So coming back to this, none of it is new, Manish. I mean, for us who've been in this space for long, and you and I have discussed something similar when we met in Singapore in 2018 or in Dubai, the classification of tokens as either a security token or a utility token or a payment token or a digital asset or commodity,
or a promissory note or a financial instrument.
Again, the taxonomy may change or change by country or with the time. Some may call it digital asset, some may call it commodity token or asset token, or the easiest way, as I see it, to understand it for a thing like Bitcoin is digital gold. As simple as that. It has become digital gold, nothing else. It's nothing like Satoshi's white paper about a rebellion against the government and the big and the Fed Reserve and the governments and the regulators and the fat cats on Wall Street. It is nothing except digital gold. And I gave that example of money going from gold ETFs to Bitcoin. So it's a reality. So let's call a spade, whether you call it a digital asset or a commodity, whatever it may be, regulated by the, and this conflict has happened in many countries, not just conflict, I would say evolution of whether the commodities commission should regulate it or the securities commission should regulate it because it's a security. Bottom line is, it can derive its value from an underlying asset, as you said, so either a digital security or a securitized asset like NFTs, or it could derive its value from just people believing in it, and which is what Bitcoin derives, or even gold derives, right? Maybe gold, people say, has functional value and utility, etc. But come on, we stopped producing gold coins for a long time. So what is the real value of utility value of gold, except people having a comfort in their minds that it is a hedge, and I want to pass it back to my children. Whether, and then this is especially true in India and China, traditional family-oriented cultures, right? So whatever be the nomenclature, I think this classification between something that is a tokenized version of a security or a commodity, or it can be used for actual transactions or consumption as a utility token, has been around ever since Ethereum came about, and many regulators and self-regulatory organizations have been saying this since 2017 and 18. So I think this is a step in the right direction, whichever way these tweaks aside. And I also believe that the crypto industry must learn to live with it and also accept reality. Don't beat around the bush. Don't try to claim you are God's gift to mankind. Say you are a digital gold. Say you are costing 40 lakh or 35 lakhs Indian rupees for one Bitcoin. That means the middle class cannot afford it, or even a small, tiny fraction of it. So call it for what it is. It is an alternative asset class. It is important. It will become more important. We've already seen it become $1 trillion, etc. It may become a five. And when you become $1 trillion asset class, even the regulators cannot ignore you. But call it for what it is. And I think the regulators are doing exactly that. They are not getting carried away, or they are not coming under the pressure of all this noise. They are seeing it for what it is. So securities in a tokenized form has its role. Digital gold as Bitcoin has its role. Ethereum and IOTA and Cardano, etc., through smart contracts and enabling DeFi or enabling utility tokens has its role. But again, none of this is new. And I keep saying this: utility tokens. So many of these blockchain guys and crypto guys try to scream at conferences about how it's the biggest invention since we discovered nuclear energy. No, it's not. It's nothing. I mean, Starbucks coupons have been around. You prepay and you own those Starbucks coupons for decades. It was in a paper format. Now you've created, then it became in a digital format, SQ points or any of these loyalty points. And now you've created it on top of a blockchain layer, either layer 1 or layer 2.
So when you're saying that, I think what comes to my mind is all the toothpaste commercials that since we've been seeing since our childhood. It's the same toothpaste with very incremental. Yeah, and with a new wrapper, and a new packaging and a new brand.
No, let's admit it. Times change. 5 years back, people invested money in gold ETFs. Now they are investing in Bitcoin in lieu of gold. So that's fine. Regulators are. I mean, it's not that they are blind, right? RBI does acknowledge Bitcoin becoming the equivalent of digital gold. They do acknowledge that securities are getting tokenized and digitized. So whatever one may call them, as long as they're clear in their understanding of where this fits, what role it plays in society. And frankly, I don't think any of the tokens, except for what we've discussed, tokens at the back end, whether it is Ripple or these cross-border MCBDC bridges, tokens have not really changed the payments world. Bitcoin is certainly, nobody even claims or has this illusion or delusion anymore.
They instead move to the asset world.
Yeah. Correct. So there is a role of reimagining payments, as I gave the example of Cambodia. There is a role of reimagining commodities, and there's a role of reimagining assets.
Correct. I think I have taken a lot of your time. This was amazing discussion. I enjoyed it, although
absolutely, it was a fabulous conversation. The pleasure was mine, and I hope our friends at ET and all of those who made it possible really enjoyed it, and so will the audience. And hopefully not just enjoy, hopefully we've shared some very honest perspectives. I have said things as they are. I have not minced words. So, if some people don't like it, please don't mind. I am only trying to give a very balanced perspective, because at GIFT and my personal capacity, I engage with ecosystem stakeholders from all over the world, but also all parts of the ecosystem. So I do have the benefit of a 360-degree view. I interact with dozens of my banker friends. I am a mentor to many fintechs. I've seen the blockchain industry evolve, and I'm involved in many of those projects. I advise many regulators. I'm also an academic, so I have to give a very balanced view, right? I have no vested agenda like some others have, so I'll not come up with a report and say, okay, this is going to create the next big Khushhali or prosperity. Put out things out there for what it is. Everybody has to get honest. The regulator has to be honest that, hey, digital gold as Bitcoin is here to stay. So either I can ignore it and say it is illegal, like China tries to do periodically, but what happens? People still aggregate Bitcoin, and then you have the other extreme of Venezuela making Bitcoin as legal tender. And I was a friend of mine who's an investment banker joked that I don't think Venezuela has ever gotten this kind of media coverage as it did by that single announcement in a long time.
Correct. So Malik, I have not seen you this candid, and I'm very happy that we did go this candid. It was a summation of a lot of, I think, experiences and discussions that we have. What made me smile was some of the thoughts and some of the pros and cons that you brought out, and I'm aware of these discussions happening in our GIFT forums. So that made a lot of smile come to my face. Thank you very much for all your time. We would converge again and probably have a more candid interview as innovations keep rocking the world. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to our friends and partners at ET as well.
Thank
have
you.
a great evening, everyone. Bye-bye.